The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton, Part 7 out of 8. Home to my husband. And you expect me to say yes to that? She raised her troubled eyes to his. What else is there? I can't stay here and lie to the people who've been good to me. That's the very reason why I ask you to come away and destroy their lives, when they've helped me to remake mine. Archer sprang to his feet, and stood looking down on her in inarticulate despair. It would have been easy to say, yes, come once. He knew the power she would put in his hands if she consented. There would be no difficulty then in persuading her not to go back to her husband. But something silenced the word on his lips. A sort of passionate honesty in her made it inconceivable that he should try to draw her into that familiar trap. If I were to let her come, he said to himself, I should have to let her go again. And that was not to be imagined. But he saw the shadow of the lashes on her wet cheek, and wavered. After all, he began again, we have lives of our own. There's no use attempting the impossible. You are so unprejudiced about some things, so used, as you say, to looking at the Gorgon, that I don't know why you are afraid to face our case and see it as it really is, unless you think the sacrifice is not worth making. She stood up also, her lips tightening under a rapid frown. Call it that, then I must go, she said, drawing her little watch from her bosom. She turned away, and he followed and caught her by the wrist. Well, then, come to me once, he said, his head turning suddenly at the thought of losing her. And for a second or two they looked at each other almost like enemies. When, he insisted, tomorrow, she hesitated. The day after. Dearest, he said again. She had disengaged her wrist, but for a moment they continued to hold each other's eyes. And he saw that her face, which had grown very pale, was flooded with a deep inner radiance. His heart beat with awe. He felt that he had never before beheld love visible. Oh, I shall be late. Goodbye. No, don't come any farther than this, she cried, walking hurriedly away down the long room. As if the reflected radiance in his eyes had frightened her. When she reached the door she turned for a moment to wave a quick farewell. Archer walked home alone. Darkness was falling when he let himself into his house, and he looked about at the familiar objects in the hall as if he viewed them from the other side of the grave. The parlor maid, hearing his step, ran up the stairs to light the gas on the upper landing. Is Mrs. Archer in? No, sir. Mrs. Archer went out in the carriage after luncheon, and hasn't come back. With a sense of relief he entered the library and flung himself down in his armchair. The parlor maid followed, bringing the student lamp and shaking some coals onto the dying fire. When she left he continued to sit motionless, his elbows on his knees, his chin on his clasped hands, his eyes fixed on the red grate. He sat there without conscious thoughts, without sense of the lapse of time, in a deep and grave amazement that seemed to suspend life rather than quicken it. This was what had to be then. This was what had to be, he kept repeating to himself as if he hung in the clutch of doom. What he had dreamed of had been so different that there was a mortal chill in his rapture. The door opened and May came in. "I am dreadfully late. You weren't worried, were you?" she asked, laying her hand on his shoulder with one of her rare caresses. He looked up astonished. "Is it late? After 7? I believe you've been asleep," she laughed, and drawing out her hatpins tossed her velvet hat on the sofa. She looked paler than usual, but sparkling with an unwonted animation. "I went to see Granny, and just as I was going away Ellen came in from a walk, so I stayed and had a long talk with her. It was ages since we should had a real talk." She had dropped into her usual armchair facing his, and was running her fingers through her rumpled hair. He fancied she expected him to speak. "A really good talk," she went on, smiling with what seemed to Archer an unnatural vividness. "She was so dear, just like the old Ellen. I am afraid I haven't been fair to her lately." "I've sometimes thought—" Archer stood up and leaned against the mantelpiece, out of the radius of the lamp. "Yes, you've thought," he echoed as she paused. "Well, perhaps I haven't judged her fairly. She's so different, at least on the surface. She takes up such odd people. She seems to like to make herself conspicuous. I suppose it's the life she's led in that fast European society. No doubt we seem dreadfully dull to her. But I don't want to judge her unfairly." She paused again, a little breathless with the unwonted length of her speech, and sat with her lips slightly parted and a deep blush on her cheeks. Archer, as he looked at her, was reminded of the glow which had suffused her face in the mission garden at St. Augustine. He became aware of the same obscure effort in her, the same reaching out toward something beyond the usual range of her vision. "She hates Ellen," he thought, "and she's trying to overcome the feeling, and to get me to help her to overcome it." The thought moved him, and for a moment he was on the point of breaking the silence between them, and throwing himself on her mercy. "You understand, don't you?" she went on. "Why the family have sometimes been annoyed. We all did what we could for her at first, but she never seemed to understand. And now this idea of going to see Mrs. Beaufort, of going there in Granny's carriage, I am afraid she's quite alienated the van der Luydens." "Ah," said Archer with an impatient laugh. The open door had closed between them again. "It's time to dress. We are dining out, aren't we?" he asked, moving from the fire. She rose also, but lingered near the hearth. As he walked past her she moved forward impulsively, as though to detain him. Their eyes met, and he saw that hers were of the same swimming blue as when he had left her to drive to Jersey City. She flung her arms about his neck and pressed her cheek to his. "You haven't kissed me today," she said in a whisper, and he felt her tremble in his arms. Roman 32. "At the court of the Tuileries," said Mr. Sillerton Jackson with his reminiscent smile, "such things were pretty openly tolerated." The scene was the van der Luydens' black walnut dining room in Madison Avenue, and the time the evening after Newland Archer's visit to the Museum of Art. Mr. and Mrs. van der Luyden had come to town for a few days from Skuytercliff, whither they had precipitately fled at the announcement of Beaufort's failure. It had been represented to them that the disarray into which society had been thrown by this deplorable affair made their presence in town more necessary than ever. It was one of the occasions when, as Mrs. Archer put it, they owed it to society to show themselves at the opera, and even to open their own doors. It will never do, my dear Louisa, to let people like Mrs. Lemuel Struthers think they can step into Regina's shoes. It is just at such times that new people push in and get a footing. It was owing to the epidemic of chicken pox in New York, the winter Mrs. Struthers first appeared, that the married men slipped away to her house while their wives were in the nursery. You and dear Henry, Louisa, must stand in the breach as you always have. Mr. and Mrs. van der Luyden could not remain deaf to such a call, and reluctantly but heroically they had come to town, unmuffled the house, and sent out invitations for 2 dinners and an evening reception. On this particular evening they had invited Sillerton Jackson, Mrs. Archer and Newland and his wife to go with them to the opera, where Faust was being sung for the first time that winter. Nothing was done without ceremony under the van der Luyden roof, and though there were but 4 guests, the repast had begun at 7 punctually, so that the proper sequence of courses might be served without haste before the gentlemen settled down to their cigars. Archer had not seen his wife since the evening before. He had left early for the office, where he had plunged into an accumulation of unimportant business. In the afternoon one of the senior partners had made an unexpected call on his time, and he had reached home so late that May had preceded him to the van der Luydens and sent back the carriage. Now, across the Skyttercliff carnations and the massive plate, she struck him as pale and languid. But her eyes shone, and she talked with exaggerated animation. The subject which had called forth Mr. Sillerton Jackson's favorite allusion had been brought up, Archer fancied not without intention, by their hostess. The Beaufort failure, or rather the Beaufort attitude since the failure, was still a fruitful theme for the drawing-room moralist, and after it had been thoroughly examined and condemned, Mrs. van der Luyden had turned her scrupulous eyes on May Archer. "Is it possible, dear, that what I hear is true? I was told your grandmother Mingot's carriage was seen standing at Mrs. Beaufort's door." It was noticeable that she no longer called the offending lady by her Christian name. May's color rose, and Mrs. Archer put in hastily, "If it was, I am convinced it was there without Mrs. Mingot's knowledge." "Ah, you think—" Mrs. van der Luyden paused, sighed, and glanced at her husband. "I am afraid," Mr. van der Luyden said, "that Madame Olenska's kind heart may have led her into the imprudence of calling on Mrs. Beaufort, or her taste for peculiar people," put in Mrs. Archer in a dry tone, while her eyes dwelt innocently on her son's. "I am sorry to think it of Madame Olenska." It was at this point that Mr. Jackson seized the chance to place his favorite allusion. At the Tuileries, he repeated, seeing the eyes of the company expectantly turned on him, the standard was excessively lax in some respects. And if you should ask where Morny's money came from, or who paid the debts of some of the court beauties, "I hope, dear Sillerton," said Mrs. Archer, You are not suggesting that we should adopt such standards. I never suggest, returned Mr. Jackson imperturbably. But Madame Olenska's foreign bringing up may make her less particular. Ah, the two elder ladies sighed. Still, to have kept her grandmother's carriage at a defaulter's door, Mr. van der Luyden protested. And Archer guessed that he was remembering and resenting the hampers of carnations he had sent to the little house in 23rd Street. Of course, I've always said that she looks at things quite differently, Mrs. Archer summed up. A flush rose to May's forehead. She looked across the table at her husband, and said precipitately, "I am sure Ellen meant it kindly." "Imprudent people are often kind," said Mrs. Archer, as if the fact were scarcely an extenuation. And Mrs. van der Luyden murmured, if only she had consulted someone. "Ah, that she never did," Mrs. Archer rejoined. At this point Mr. van der Luyden glanced at his wife, who bent her head slightly in the direction of Mrs. Archer. And the glimmering trains of the three ladies swept out of the door while the gentlemen settled down to their cigars. Mr. van der Luyden supplied short ones on opera nights, but they were so good that they made his guests deplore his inexorable punctuality. Archer, after the first act, had detached himself from the party and made his way to the back of the club box. From there he watched, over various Chivers, Mingot and Rushworth shoulders, the same scene that he had looked at 2 years previously, on the night of his first meeting with Ellen Olenska. He had half expected her to appear again in old Mrs. Mingot's box, but it remained empty. And he sat motionless, his eyes fastened on it, till suddenly Madame Nilsson's pure soprano broke out into Mama. Non-Mama. Archer turned to the stage, where, in the familiar setting of giant roses and penwiper pansies, the same large blonde victim was succumbing to the same small brown seducer. From the stage his eyes wandered to the point of the horseshoe where May sat between two older ladies. Just as on that former evening, she had sat between Mrs. Lovell Mingot and her newly arrived foreign cousin. As on that evening, she was all in white, and Archer, who had not noticed what she wore, recognized the blue-white satin and old lace of her wedding dress. It was the custom in old New York for brides to appear in this costly garment during the first year or two of marriage. His mother, he knew, kept hers in tissue paper in the hope that Janie might some day wear it, though poor Janie was reaching the age when pearl gray poplin and no bridesmaids would be thought more appropriate. It struck Archer that May, since their return from Europe, had seldom worn her bridal satin, and the surprise of seeing her in it made him compare her appearance with that of the young girl he had watched with such blissful anticipations 2 years earlier. Though May's outline was slightly heavier, as her goddess-like build had foretold, her athletic erectness of carriage, and the girlish transparency of her expression, remained unchanged, but for the slight languor that Archer had lately noticed in her she would have been the exact image of the girl playing with the bouquet of lilies of the valley on her betrothal evening. The fact seemed an additional appeal to his pity. Such innocence was as moving as the trustful clasp of a child. Then he remembered the passionate generosity latent under that incurious calm. He recalled her glance of understanding when he had urged that their engagement should be announced at the Beaufort ball. He heard the voice in which she had said in the Mission garden, "I couldn't have my happiness made out of a wrong to someone else." And an uncontrollable longing seized him to tell her the truth, to throw himself on her generosity, and ask for the freedom he had once refused. Newland Archer was a quiet and self-controlled young man. Conformity to the discipline of a small society had become almost his second nature. It was deeply distasteful to him to do anything melodramatic and conspicuous, anything Mr. van der Luyden would have deprecated, and the club box condemned as bad form. But he had become suddenly unconscious of the club box, of Mr. van der Luyden, of all that had so long enclosed him in the warm shelter of habit. He walked along the semicircular passage at the back of the house, and opened the door of Mrs. van der Luyden's box as if it had been a gate into the unknown. "Mamma," thrilled out the triumphant Marguerite, and the occupants of the box looked up in surprise at Archer's entrance. He had already broken one of the rules of his world, which forbade the entering of a box during a solo. Slipping between Mr. van der Luyden and Sillerton Jackson, he leaned over his wife. "I've got a beastly headache. Don't tell anyone, but come home, won't you?" he whispered. May gave him a glance of comprehension, and he saw her whisper to his mother, who nodded sympathetically. Then she murmured an excuse to Mrs. van der Luyden, and rose from her seat just as Marguerite fell into Faust's arms. Archer, while he helped her on with her opera cloak, noticed the exchange of a significant smile between the older ladies. As they drove away, May laid her hand shyly on his. "I am so sorry you don't feel well. I am afraid they've been overworking you again at the office." "No, it's not that. Do you mind if I open the window?" he returned confusedly, letting down the pane on his side. He sat staring out into the street, feeling his wife beside him as a silent, watchful interrogation, and keeping his eyes steadily fixed on the passing houses. At their door she caught her skirt in the step of the carriage and fell against him. "Did you hurt yourself?" he asked, steadying her with his arm. "No, but my poor dress, see how I've torn it," she exclaimed. She bent to gather up a mud-stained breadth, and followed him up the steps into the hall. The servants had not expected them so early, and there was only a glimmer of gas on the upper landing. Archer mounted the stairs, turned up the light, and put a match to the brackets on each side of the library mantelpiece. The curtains were drawn, and the warm, friendly aspect of the room smote him like that of a familiar face met during an unavowable errand. He noticed that his wife was very pale, and asked if he should get her some brandy. "Oh, no," she exclaimed with a momentary flush as she took off her cloak. "But hadn't you better go to bed at once?" she added as he opened a silver box on the table and took out a cigarette. Archer threw down the cigarette and walked to his usual place by the fire. "No, my head is not as bad as that." He paused. "And there's something I want to say." She had dropped into an armchair, and raised her head as he spoke. Yes, dear, she rejoined, so gently that he wondered at the lack of wonder with which she received this preamble. May, he began, standing a few feet from her chair, and looking over at her as if the slight distance between them were an unbridgeable abyss. The sound of his voice echoed uncannily through the home-like hush, and he repeated, "There is something I've got to tell you." "About myself." She sat silent, without a movement or a tremor of her lashes. She was still extremely pale, but her face had a curious tranquillity of expression that seemed drawn from some secret inner source. Archer checked the conventional phrases of self-accusal that were crowding to his lips. He was determined to put the case baldly, without vain recrimination or excuse. "Madame Olenska," he said, but at the name his wife raised her hand as if to silence him. As she did so, the gaslight struck on the gold of her wedding ring. "Oh, why should we talk about Ellen tonight?" she asked with a slight pout of impatience. "Because I ought to have spoken before." Her face remained calm. "Is it really worth while, dear? I know I've been unfair to her at times, perhaps we all have." "You've understood her, no doubt, better than we did. You've always been kind to her." "But what does it matter, now it's all over?" Archer looked at her blankly. Could it be possible that the sense of unreality in which he felt himself imprisoned had communicated itself to his wife? "All over, what do you mean?" he asked in an indistinct stammer. May still looked at him with transparent eyes. "Why, since she's going back to Europe so soon. Since Granny approves and understands, and has arranged to make her independent of her husband." She broke off, and Archer, grasping the corner of the mantelpiece in one convulsed hand, and steadying himself against it, made a vain effort to extend the same control to his reeling thoughts. "I supposed," he heard his wife's even voice go on, "that you had been kept at the office this evening about the business arrangements." "It was settled this morning, I believe." She lowered her eyes under his unseeing stare, and another fugitive flush passed over her face. He understood that his own eyes must be unbearable, and turning away, rested his elbows on the mantel shelf and covered his face. Something drummed and clanged furiously in his ears. He could not tell if it were the blood in his veins or the tick of the clock on the mantel. May sat without moving or speaking while the clock slowly measured out 5 minutes. A lump of coal fell forward in the grate, and hearing her rise to push it back, Archer at length turned and faced her. "It's impossible," he exclaimed, "impossible. I saw Ellen yesterday. I told you I should seen her at Granny's." "It wasn't then that she told you." "No, I had a note from her this afternoon." "Do you want to see it?" He could not find his voice, and she went out of the room, and came back almost immediately. "I thought you knew," she said simply. She laid a sheet of paper on the table, and Archer put out his hand and took it up. The letter contained only a few lines. "May dear, I have at last made Granny understand that my visit to her could be no more than a visit. And she has been as kind and generous as ever. She sees now that if I return to Europe I must live by myself, or rather with poor Aunt Medora, who is coming with me. I am hurrying back to Washington to pack up, and we sail next week. You must be very good to Granny when I am gone, as good as you've always been to me. Ellen, if any of my friends wish to urge me to change my mind, please tell them it would be utterly useless. Archer read the letter over 2 or 3 times, then he flung it down and burst out laughing. The sound of his laugh startled him. It recalled Janie's midnight fright when she had caught him rocking with incomprehensible mirth over May's telegram announcing that the date of their marriage had been advanced. "Why did she write this?" he asked, checking his laugh with a supreme effort. May met the question with her unshaken candor. "I suppose because we talked things over yesterday." "What things?" I told her I was afraid I hadn't been fair to her, hadn't always understood how hard it must have been for her here, alone among so many people who were relations and yet strangers, who felt the right to criticize, and yet didn't always know the circumstances. She paused. "I knew you should been the one friend she could always count on, and I wanted her to know that you and I were the same in all our feelings." She hesitated, as if waiting for him to speak, and then added slowly, "She understood my wishing to tell her this. I think she understands everything." She went up to Archer, and taking one of his cold hands pressed it quickly against her cheek. "My head aches too. Good night, dear," she said, and turned to the door, her torn and muddy wedding dress dragging after her across the room. Roman 33. It was, as Mrs. Archer smilingly said to Mrs. Welland, a great event for a young couple to give their first big dinner. The Newland Archers, since they had set up their household, had received a good deal of company in an informal way. Archer was fond of having 3 or 4 friends to dine, and May welcomed them with the beaming readiness of which her mother had set her the example in conjugal affairs. Her husband questioned whether, if left to herself, she would ever have asked anyone to the house. But he had long given up trying to disengage her real self from the shape into which tradition and training had molded her. It was expected that well-off young couples in New York should do a good deal of informal entertaining. And a Welland married to an Archer was doubly pledged to the tradition. But a big dinner, with a hired chef and 2 borrowed footmen, with Roman punch, roses from Henderson's, and menus on gilt-edged cards, was a different affair and not to be lightly undertaken. As Mrs. Archer remarked, the Roman punch made all the difference, not in itself, but by its manifold implications, since it signified either canvas backs or terrapin. 2 soups, a hot and a cold sweet, full décolletage with short sleeves, and guests of a proportionate importance. It was always an interesting occasion when a young pair launched their first invitations in the third person, and their summons was seldom refused even by the seasoned and sought after. Still, it was admittedly a triumph that the van der Luydens, at May's request, should have stayed over in order to be present at her farewell dinner for the Countess Olenska. The 2 mothers-in-law sat in May's drawing-room on the afternoon of the great day, Mrs. Archer writing out the menus on Tiffany's thickest gilt-edged Bristol, while Mrs. Welland superintended the placing of the palms and standard lamps. Archer, arriving late from his office, found them still there. Mrs. Archer had turned her attention to the name cards for the table, and Mrs. Welland was considering the effect of bringing forward the large gilt sofa, so that another corner might be created between the piano and the window. May, they told him, was in the dining room inspecting the mound of jacqueminot roses and maidenhair in the center of the long table, and the placing of the Maillard bonbons in open-work silver baskets between the candelabra. On the piano stood a large basket of orchids which Mr. van der Luyden had sent from Skuytercliff. Everything was, in short, as it should be on the approach of so considerable an event. Mrs. Archer ran thoughtfully over the list, checking off each name with her sharp gold pen. Henry van der Luyden, Louisa, the Lovell Mingots, the Reggie Chiverses, Lawrence Lefferts, and Gertrude, yes. I suppose May was right to have them, the Selfridge Marys, Sillerton Jackson, Van Newland and his wife. How time passes! It seems only yesterday that he was your best man, Newland and Countess Olenska, yes. I think that's all. Mrs. Welland surveyed her son-in-law affectionately. No one can say, Newland, that you and May are not giving Ellen a handsome send-off. Ah, well, said Mrs. Archer, I understand May's wanting her cousin to tell people abroad that we are not quite barbarians. I am sure Ellen will appreciate it. She was to arrive this morning, I believe. It will make a most charming last impression. The evening before sailing is usually so dreary, Mrs. Welland cheerfully continued. Archer turned toward the door, and his mother-in-law called to him, Do go in and have a peep at the table, and don't let May tire herself too much. But he affected not to hear, and sprang up the stairs to his library. The room looked at him like an alien countenance composed into a polite grimace, and he perceived that it had been ruthlessly tidied and prepared by a judicious distribution of ash-trays and cedar-wood boxes for the gentlemen to smoke in. Ah, well, he thought, it's not for long, and he went on to his dressing-room. 10 days had passed since Madame Olenska's departure from New York. During those 10 days Archer had had no sign from her but that conveyed by the return of a key wrapped in tissue paper and sent to his office in a sealed envelope addressed in her hand. This retort to his last appeal might have been interpreted as a classic move in a familiar game, but the young man chose to give it a different meaning. She was still fighting against her fate, but she was going to Europe, and she was not returning to her husband. Nothing, therefore, was to prevent his following her, and once he had taken the irrevocable step, he believed she would not send him away. This confidence in the future had steadied him to play his part in the present. It had kept him from writing to her or betraying, by any sign or act, his misery and mortification. It seemed to him that, in the deadly silent game between them, the trumps were still in his hands, and he waited. There had been, nevertheless, moments sufficiently difficult to pass, as when Mr. Letterblair, the day after Madame Olenska's departure, had sent for him to go over the details of the trust which Mrs. Manson Mingot wished to create for her granddaughter. For a couple of hours Archer had examined the terms of the deed with his senior, all the while obscurely feeling that if he had been consulted it was for some reason other than the obvious one of his cousinship, and that the close of the conference would reveal it. "Well, the lady can't deny that it's a handsome arrangement," Mr. Letterblair had summed up, after mumbling over a summary of the settlement. "In fact, I am bound to say she's been treated pretty handsomely all round." "All round," Archer echoed with a touch of derision. "Do you refer to her husband's proposal to give her back her own money?" Mr. Letterblair's bushy eyebrows went up a fraction of an inch. "My dear sir, the law's the law, and your wife's cousin was married under the French law. It's to be presumed she knew what that meant. Even if she did, what happened subsequently—" But Archer paused. Mr. Letterblair had laid his pen handle against his big corrugated nose, and was looking down it with the expression assumed by virtuous elderly gentlemen when they wish their youngers to understand that virtue is not synonymous with ignorance. "My dear sir, I've no wish to extenuate the Count's transgressions, but on the other side, I wouldn't put my hand in the fire, well, that there hadn't been tit for tat with the young champion." Mr. Letterblair unlocked a drawer and pushed a folded paper toward Archer. "This report, the result of discreet inquiries." And then, as Archer made no effort to glance at the paper or to repudiate the suggestion, the lawyer somewhat flatly continued, "I don't say it's conclusive, you observe, far from it. But straws show, and on the whole it's eminently satisfactory for all parties that this dignified solution has been reached." "Oh, eminently," Archer assented, pushing back the paper. A day or two later, on responding to a summons from Mrs. Manson Mingott, his soul had been more deeply tried. He had found the old lady depressed and querulous. "You know she's deserted me," she began at once. And without waiting for his reply, "Oh, don't ask me why, she gave so many reasons that I've forgotten them all. My private belief is that she couldn't face the boredom. At any rate, that's what Augusta and my daughters-in-law think. And I don't know that I altogether blame her. Olenska's a finished scoundrel, but life with him must have been a good deal gayer than it is in Fifth Avenue. Not that the family would admit that. They think Fifth Avenue is heaven with the Rue de la Paix thrown in. And poor Ellen, of course, has no idea of going back to her husband. She held out as firmly as ever against that. So she's to settle down in Paris with that fool Medora. Well, Paris is Paris, and you can keep a carriage there on next to nothing. But she was as gay as a bird, and I shall miss her." 2 tears, the parched tears of the old, rolled down her puffy cheeks and vanished in the abysses of her bosom. "All I ask is," she concluded, "that they shouldn't bother me any more. I must really be allowed to digest my gruel," and she twinkled a little wistfully at Archer. It was that evening, on his return home, that May announced her intention of giving a farewell dinner to her cousin. Madame Olenska's name had not been pronounced between them since the night of her flight to Washington, and Archer looked at his wife with surprise. "A dinner, why?" he interrogated. Her color rose. "But you like Ellen, I thought you should be pleased." "It's awfully nice you're putting it in that way, but I really don't see." "I mean to do it, Newland," she said, quietly rising and going to her desk. "Here are the invitations all written. Mother helped me. She agrees that we ought to." She paused, embarrassed and yet smiling, and Archer suddenly saw before him the embodied image of the family. "Oh, all right," he said, staring with unseeing eyes at the list of guests that she had put in his hand. When he entered the drawing-room before dinner, May was stooping over the fire and trying to coax the logs to burn in their unaccustomed setting of immaculate tiles. The tall lamps were all lit, and Mr. van der Luyden's orchids had been conspicuously disposed in various receptacles of modern porcelain and knobby silver. Mrs. Newland Archer's drawing-room was generally thought a great success. A gilt bamboo jardiniere, in which the primulas and cinerarias were punctually renewed, blocked the access to the bay window where the old-fashioned would have preferred a bronze reduction of the Venus of Milo. The sofas and armchairs of pale brocade were cleverly grouped about little plush tables densely covered with silver toys. Porcelain animals and efflorescent photograph frames and tall rosy-shaded lamps shot up like tropical flowers among the palms. "I don't think Ellen has ever seen this room lighted up," said May, rising flushed from her struggle, and sending about her a glance of pardonable pride. The brass tongs which she had propped against the side of the chimney fell with a crash that drowned her husband's answer. And before he could restore them, Mr. and Mrs. van der Luyden were announced. The other guests quickly followed, for it was known that the van der Luydens liked to dine punctually. The room was nearly full, and Archer was engaged in showing to Mrs. Selfridge Mary a small, highly varnished Verbekoven study of sheep, which Mr. Welland had given May for Christmas, when he found Madame Olenska at his side. She was excessively pale, and her pallor made her dark hair seem denser and heavier than ever. Perhaps that, or the fact that she had wound several rows of amber beads about her neck, reminded him suddenly of the little Ellen Mingot he had danced with at children's parties, when Medora Manson had first brought her to New York. The amber beads were trying to her complexion, or her dress was perhaps unbecoming. Her face looked lusterless and almost ugly. And he had never loved it as he did at that minute. Their hands met, and he thought he heard her say, "Yes, we are sailing tomorrow in the Russia." Then there was an unmeaning noise of opening doors, and after an interval May's voice, "Newland, dinner's been announced. Won't you please take Ellen in?" Madame Olenska put her hand on his arm, and he noticed that the hand was ungloved, and remembered how he had kept his eyes fixed on it the evening that he had sat with her in the little 23rd Street drawing-room. All the beauty that had forsaken her face seemed to have taken refuge in the long pale fingers and faintly dimpled knuckles on his sleeve. And he said to himself, "If it were only to see her hand again, I should have to follow her." It was only at an entertainment ostensibly offered to a foreign visitor that Mrs. van der Luyden could suffer the diminution of being placed on her host's left. The fact of Madame Olenska's foreignness could hardly have been more adroitly emphasized than by this farewell tribute. and Mrs. van der Luyden accepted her displacement with an affability which left no doubt as to her approval. There were certain things that had to be done, and if done at all, done handsomely and thoroughly, and one of these, in the old New York code, was the tribal rally around a kinswoman about to be eliminated from the tribe. There was nothing on earth that the Wellens and Mingots would not have done to proclaim their unalterable affection for the Countess Olenska now that her passage for Europe was engaged. And Archer, at the head of his table, sat marveling at the silent, untiring activity with which her popularity had been retrieved. Grievances against her silenced, her past countenanced, and her present irradiated by the family approval. Mrs. van der Luyden shone on her with the dim benevolence which was her nearest approach to cordiality. And Mr. van der Luyden, from his seat at May's right, cast down the table glances plainly intended to justify all the carnations he had sent from Skuytercliff. Archer, who seemed to be assisting at the scene in a state of odd imponderability, as if he floated somewhere between chandelier and ceiling, wondered at nothing so much as his own share in the proceedings. As his glance travelled from one placid, well-fed face to another, he saw all the harmless-looking people engaged upon May's canvas backs as a band of dumb conspirators, and himself and the pale woman on his right as the centre of their conspiracy. And then it came over him, in a vast flash made up of many broken gleams, that to all of them he and Madame Olenska were lovers. Lovers in the extreme sense peculiar to foreign vocabularies. He guessed himself to have been for months the centre of countless silently observing eyes and patiently listening ears. He understood that, by means as yet unknown to him, the separation between himself and the partner of his guilt had been achieved, and that now the whole tribe had rallied about his wife on the tacit assumption that nobody knew anything, or had ever imagined anything, and that the occasion of the entertainment was simply May Archer's natural desire to take an affectionate leave of her friend and cousin. It was the old New York way of taking life without effusion of blood, the way of people who dreaded scandal more than disease, who placed decency above courage, and who considered that nothing was more ill-bred than seems, except the behavior of those who gave rise to them. As these thoughts succeeded each other in his mind, Archer felt like a prisoner in the center of an armed camp. He looked about the table, and guessed at the inexorableness of his captors from the tone in which, over the asparagus from Florida, they were dealing with Beaufort and his wife. "It's to show me," he thought, "what would happen to me," and a deathly sense of the superiority of implication and analogy over direct action, and of silence over rash words, closed in on him like the doors of the family vault. He laughed and met Mrs. van der Luyden's startled eyes. "You think it laughable," she said with a pinched smile. "Of course, poor Regina's idea of remaining in New York has its ridiculous side, I suppose." And Archer muttered, "Of course." At this point, he became conscious that Madame Olenska's other neighbor had been engaged for some time with the lady on his right. At the same moment he saw that May, serenely enthroned between Mr. van der Luyden and Mr. Selfridge Merry, had cast a quick glance down the table, It was evident that the host and the lady on his right could not sit through the whole meal in silence. He turned to Madame Olenska, and her pale smile met him. "Oh, do let's see it through," it seemed to say. "Did you find the journey tiring?" he asked in a voice that surprised him by its naturalness. And she answered that, on the contrary, she had seldom traveled with fewer discomforts. "Except, the dreadful heat in the train," she added, and he remarked that she would not suffer from that particular hardship in the country she was going to. "I never," he declared with intensity, "was more nearly frozen than once in April in the train between Calais and Paris." She said she did not wonder, but remarked that, after all, one could always carry an extra rug, and that every form of travel had its hardships. To which he abruptly returned that he thought them all of no account compared with the blessedness of getting away. She changed color, and he added, his voice suddenly rising in pitch, "I mean to do a lot of traveling myself before long." A tremor crossed her face, and leaning over to Reggie Chivers, he cried out, "I say, Reggie, what do you say to a trip round the world, now? Next month, I mean. I am game if you are." At which Mrs. Reggie piped up that she could not think of letting Reggie go till after the Martha Washington ball. And her husband placidly observed that by that time he would have to be practicing for the international polo match. But Mr. Selfridge Merry had caught the phrase round the world, and having once circled the globe in his steam yacht, he seized the opportunity to send down the table several striking items concerning the shallowness of the Mediterranean ports. Though, after all, he added, it didn't matter, for when you should seen Athens and Smyrna and Constantinople. What else was there? And Mrs. Merry said she could never be too grateful to Dr. Bencomb for having made them promise not to go to Naples on account of the fever. "But you must have 3 weeks to do India properly," her husband conceded, anxious to have it understood that he was no frivolous globe-trotter. And at this point the ladies went up to the drawing-room. In the library, in spite of weightier presences, Lawrence Lefferts predominated. The talk, as usual, had veered around to the Beauforts, and even Mr. van der Luyden and Mr. Selfridge Merry, installed in the honorary arm-chairs tacitly reserved for them, paused to listen to the younger man's philippic. Never had Lefferts so abounded in the sentiments that adorn Christian manhood and exalt the sanctity of the home. Indignation lent him a scathing eloquence, and it was clear that if others had followed his example, and acted as he talked, society would never have been weak enough to receive a foreign upstart like Beaufort. No, sir. Not even if he should marry a van der Luyden or a Lanning instead of a Dallas. And what chance would there have been, Lefferts wrathfully questioned, of his marrying into such a family as the Dallases, if he had not already wormed his way into certain houses, as people like Mrs. Lemuel Struthers had managed to worm theirs in his wake? If society chose to open its doors to vulgar women, the harm was not great, though the gain was doubtful. But once it got in the way of tolerating men of obscure origin and tainted wealth, the end was total disintegration, and at no distant date. If things go on at this pace, Lefferts thundered, looking like a young prophet dressed by Poole, and who had not yet been stoned, We shall see our children fighting for invitations to swindlers' houses and marrying Beaufort's bastards." "Oh, I say, draw it mild," Reggie Chivers and young Newland protested, while Mr. Selfridge Merry looked genuinely alarmed. And an expression of pain and disgust settled on Mr. van der Luyden's sensitive face. "Has he got any?" cried Mr. Sillerton Jackson, pricking up his ears, and while Lefferts tried to turn the question with a laugh, the old gentleman twittered into Archer's ear, "Queer, those fellows who are always wanting to set things right. The people who have the worst cooks are always telling you they are poisoned when they dine out. But I hear there are pressing reasons for our friend Lawrence's diatribe. Typewriter this time, I understand." The talk swept past Archer like some senseless river running and running because it did not know enough to stop. He saw on the faces about him expressions of interest, amusement, and even mirth. He listened to the younger men's laughter, and to the praise of the Archer Madeira, which Mr. van der Luyden and Mr. Merry were thoughtfully celebrating. Through it all he was dimly aware of a general attitude of friendliness toward himself, as if the guard of the prisoner he felt himself to be were trying to soften his captivity. And the perception increased his passionate determination to be free. In the drawing-room, where they presently joined the ladies, he met May's triumphant eyes, and read in them the conviction that everything had gone off beautifully. She rose from Madame Olenska's side, and immediately Mrs. van der Luyden beckoned the latter to a seat on the gilt sofa where she throned. Mrs. Selfridge Merry bore across the room to join them, and it became clear to Archer that here also a conspiracy of rehabilitation and obliteration was going on. The silent organization which held his little world together was determined to put itself on record as never for a moment having questioned the propriety of Madame Olenska's conduct, or the completeness of Archer's domestic felicity. All these amiable and inexorable persons were resolutely engaged in pretending to each other that they had never heard of, suspected, or even conceived possible the least hint to the contrary, and from this tissue of elaborate mutual dissimulation Archer once more disengaged the fact that New York believed him to be Madame Olenska's lover. He caught the glitter of victory in his wife's eyes, and for the first time understood that she shared the belief. The discovery roused a laughter of inner devils that reverberated through all his efforts to discuss the Martha Washington ball with Mrs. Reggie Chivers and little Mrs. Newland. And so the evening swept on, running and running like a senseless river that did not know how to stop. At length he saw that Madame Olenska had risen and was saying good-bye. He understood that in a moment she would be gone, and tried to remember what he had said to her at dinner. But he could not recall a single word they had exchanged. She went up to May, the rest of the company making a circle about her as she advanced. The two young women clasped hands, then May bent forward and kissed her cousin. "Certainly our hostess is much the handsomer of the two," Archer heard Reggie Chivers say in an undertone to young Mrs. Newland. And he remembered Beaufort's coarse sneer at May's ineffectual beauty. A moment later he was in the hall, putting Madame Olenska's cloak about her shoulders. Through all his confusion of mind, he had held fast to the resolve to say nothing that might startle or disturb her. Convinced that no power could now turn him from his purpose, he had found strength to let events shape themselves as they would. But as he followed Madame Olenska into the hall, he thought with a sudden hunger of being for a moment alone with her at the door of her carriage. "Is your carriage here?" he asked, and at that moment Mrs. van der Luyden, who was being majestically inserted into her sables, said gently, "We are driving dear Ellen home." Archer's heart gave a jerk, and Madame Olenska, clasping her cloak and fan with one hand, held out the other to him. "Good-bye," she said. "Good-bye, but I shall see you soon in Paris." He answered aloud. It seemed to him that he had shouted it. "Oh," she murmured, "if you and May could come." Mr. van der Luyden advanced to give her his arm, and Archer turned to Mrs. van der Luyden. For a moment, in the billowy darkness inside the big landau, he caught the dim oval of a face, eyes shining steadily, and she was gone. As he went up the steps he crossed Lawrence Lefferts coming down with his wife. Lefferts caught his host by the sleeve, drawing back to let Gertrude pass. "I say, old chap, do you mind just letting it be understood that I am dining with you at the club tomorrow night? Thanks so much. You old brick, good night." "It did go off beautifully, didn't it?" May questioned from the threshold of the library. Archer roused himself with a start. As soon as the last carriage had driven away, he had come up to the library and shut himself in, with the hope that his wife, who still lingered below, would go straight to her room. But there she stood, pale and drawn, yet radiating the factitious energy of one who has passed beyond fatigue. "May I come and talk it over?" she asked. "Of course, if you like." "But you must be awfully sleepy." "No, I am not sleepy." "I should like to sit with you a little." "Very well," he said, pushing her chair near the fire. She sat down and he resumed his seat, but neither spoke for a long time. At length Archer began abruptly, "Since you are not tired, and want to talk, there's something I must tell you. I tried to the other night." She looked at him quickly. "Yes, dear, something about yourself." Horribly tired. In an instant she was all tender anxiety. "Oh, I've seen it coming on, Newland. You've been so wickedly overworked." "Perhaps it's that. Anyhow, I want to make a break, to give up the law. To go away, at any rate at once. On a long trip, ever so far off, away from everything." He paused, conscious that he had failed in his attempt to speak with the indifference of a man who longs for a change, and is yet too weary to welcome it. Do what he would, the chord of eagerness vibrated. "Away from everything," he repeated. "Ever so far. Where, for instance?" she asked. "Oh, I don't know. India or Japan." She stood up, and as he sat with bent head, his chin propped on his hands, He felt her warmly and fragrantly hovering over him. "As far as that. But I am afraid you can't, dear," she said in an unsteady voice. "Not unless you will take me with you." And then, as he was silent, she went on, in tones so clear and evenly pitched that each separate syllable tapped like a little hammer on his brain, "That is, if the doctors will let me go. But I am afraid they won't. For you see, Newland, I've been sure since this morning of something I've been so longing and hoping for." He looked up at her with a sick stare, and she sank down, all dew and roses, and hid her face against his knee. "Oh, my dear," he said, holding her to him while his cold hand stroked her hair. There was a long pause, which the inner devils filled with strident laughter. Then May freed herself from his arms and stood up. "You didn't guess." "Yes, I know. That is, of course, I hoped." They looked at each other for an instant and again fell silent. Then, turning his eyes from hers, he asked abruptly, "Have you told anyone else?" "Only Mamma and your mother." She paused, and then added hurriedly, the blood flushing up to her forehead, "that is, and Ellen. You know, I told you we should have a long talk one afternoon, and how dear she was to me." "Ah," said Archer, his heart stopping. He felt that his wife was watching him intently. "Did you mind my telling her first, Newland?" "Mind? Why should I?" He made a last effort to collect himself. "But that was a fortnight ago, wasn't it? I thought you said you weren't sure till today." Her color burned deeper, but she held his gaze. "No, I wasn't sure then, but I told her I was. And you see I was right," she exclaimed, her blue eyes wet with victory. Roman 34. Newland Archer sat at the writing table in his library in East 39th Street. He had just got back from a big official reception for the inauguration of the new galleries at the Metropolitan Museum. And the spectacle of those great spaces crowded with the spoils of the ages, where the throng of fashion circulated through a series of scientifically catalogued treasures, had suddenly pressed on a rusted spring of memory. "Why, this used to be one of the old Cessnola rooms," he heard someone say. And instantly everything about him vanished, and he was sitting alone on a hard leather divan against a radiator, while a slight figure in a long sealskin cloak moved away down the meagerly fitted vista of the old museum. The vision had roused a host of other associations, and he sat looking with new eyes at the library which, for over 30 years, had been the scene of his solitary musings and of all the family confabulations. It was the room in which most of the real things of his life had happened. There his wife, nearly 26 years ago, had broken to him, with a blushing circumlocution that would have caused the young women of the new generation to smile, the news that she was to have a child, and their eldest boy, Dallas, too delicate to be taken to church in midwinter, had been christened by their old friend the Bishop of New York, the ample, magnificent, irreplaceable bishop, so long the pride and ornament of his diocese. Their Dallas had first staggered across the floor shouting, "Dad!" while May and the nurse laughed behind the door. Their second child, Mary, who was so like her mother, had announced her engagement to the dullest and most reliable of Reggie Chiver's many sons. And their Archer had kissed her through her wedding veil before they went down to the motor which was to carry them to Grace Church, for in a world where all else had reeled on its foundations, the Grace Church wedding remained an unchanged institution. It was in the library that he and May had always discussed the future of the children, the studies of Dallas and his young brother Bill. Mary's incurable indifference to accomplishments, and passion for sport and philanthropy, and the vague leanings toward art which had finally landed the restless and curious Dallas in the office of a rising New York architect. The young men nowadays were emancipating themselves from the law and business and taking up all sorts of new things. If they were not absorbed in state politics or municipal reform, the chances were that they were going in for Central American archaeology, for architecture or landscape engineering, taking a keen and learned interest in the pre-revolutionary buildings of their own country, studying and adapting Georgian types, and protesting at the meaningless use of the word colonial. Nobody nowadays had colonial houses except the millionaire grocers of the suburbs. But above all, sometimes Archer put it above all, it was in that library that the governor of New York, coming down from Albany one evening to dine and spend the night, had turned to his host and said, banging his clenched fist on the table and gnashing his eyeglasses, "Hang the professional politician, you are the kind of man the country wants. Archer, if the stable's ever to be cleaned out, men like you have got to lend a hand in the cleaning." Men like you, how Archer had glowed at the phrase, how eagerly he had risen up at the call. It was an echo of Ned Winsett's old appeal to roll his sleeves up and get down into the muck, but spoken by a man who set the example of the gesture, and whose summons to follow him was irresistible. Archer, as he looked back, was not sure that men like himself were what his country needed, at least in the active service to which Theodore Roosevelt had pointed. In fact, there was reason to think it did not, for after a year in the State Assembly, he had not been re-elected, and had dropped back thankfully into obscure if useful municipal work, and from that again to the writing of occasional articles in one of the reforming weeklies that were trying to shake the country out of its apathy. It was little enough to look back on, but when he remembered to what the young men of his generation and his set had looked forward, the narrow groove of money-making, sport, and society to which their vision had been limited, even his small contribution to the new state of things seemed to count. As each brick counts in a well-built wall, he had done little in public life. He would always be by nature a contemplative and a dilettante. But he had had high things to contemplate, great things to delight in, and one great man's friendship to be his strength and pride. He had been, in short, what people were beginning to call a good citizen in New York. For many years past, every new movement, philanthropic, municipal or artistic, had taken account of his opinion and wanted his name. People said, "Ask Archer," when there was a question of starting the first school for crippled children, reorganizing the Museum of Art, founding the Grolier Club, inaugurating the new library, or getting up a new society of chamber music. His days were full, and they were filled decently. He supposed it was all a man ought to ask. Something he knew he had missed, the flower of life. But he thought of it now as a thing so unattainable and improbable that to have repined would have been like despairing, because one had not drawn the first prize in a lottery. There were 100 million tickets in his lottery, and there was only one prize. The chances had been too decidedly against him. When he thought of Ellen Olenska, it was abstractly, serenely, as one might think of some imaginary beloved in a book or a picture. She had become the composite vision of all that he had missed. That vision, faint and tenuous as it was, had kept him from thinking of other women. He had been what was called a faithful husband, and when May had suddenly died, carried off by the infectious pneumonia through which she had nursed their youngest child, he had honestly mourned her. Their long years together had shown him that it did not so much matter if marriage was a dull duty, as long as it kept the dignity of a duty. Lapsing from that, it became a mere battle of ugly appetites. Looking about him, he honored his own past and mourned for it. After all, there was good in the old ways. His eyes, making the round of the room done over by Dallas with English mezzotints, Chippendale cabinets, bits of chosen blue and white and pleasantly shaded electric lamps, came back to the old Eastlake writing table that he had never been willing to banish, and to his first photograph of May, which still kept its place beside his inkstand. There she was, tall, round-bosomed and willowy, in her starched muslin and flapping leghorn, as he had seen her under the orange trees in the Mission garden. And as he had seen her that day, so she had remained, never quite at the same height, yet never far below it, generous, faithful, unwearied, but so lacking in imagination, so incapable of growth, that the world of her youth had fallen into pieces and rebuilt itself, without her ever being conscious of the change. This hard, bright blindness had kept her immediate horizon apparently unaltered. Her incapacity to recognize change made her children conceal their views from her as Archer concealed his. There had been, from the first, a joint pretense of sameness, a kind of innocent family hypocrisy, in which father and children had unconsciously collaborated, and she had died thinking the world a good place, full of loving and harmonious households like her own, and resigned to leave it because she was convinced that, whatever happened, Newland would continue to inculcate in Dallas the same principles and prejudices which had shaped his parents' lives, and that Dallas in turn, when Newland followed her, would transmit the sacred trust to little Bill. And of Mary she was sure as of her own self. She went contentedly to her place in the Archer vault in St. Mark's, where Mrs. Archer already lay safe from the terrifying trend which her daughter-in-law had never even become aware of. Opposite May's portrait stood one of her daughter. Mary Chivers was as tall and fair as her mother, but large-waisted, flat-chested and slightly slouching, as the altered fashion required. Mary Chivers' mighty feats of athleticism could not have been performed with the 20-inch waist that May Archer's azure sash so easily spanned. And the difference seemed symbolic. The mother's life had been as closely girt as her figure. Mary, who was no less conventional and no more intelligent, yet led a larger life and held more tolerant views. There was good in the new order, too. The telephone clicked, and Archer, turning from the photographs, unhooked the transmitter at his elbow. How far they were from the days when the legs of the brass-buttoned messenger boy had been New York's only means of quick communication. "Chicago wants you." It must be a long distance from Dallas, who had been sent to Chicago by his firm to talk over the plan of the lakeside palace they were to build for a young millionaire with ideas. The firm always sent Dallas on such errands. "Hallo, Dad." "Yes, Dallas." "I say, how do you feel about sailing on Wednesday, Mauritania?" "Yes, next Wednesday as ever is." "Our client wants me to look at some Italian gardens before we settle anything, and has asked me to nip over on the next boat." "I've got to be back on the 1st of June." The voice broke into a joyful, conscious laugh. "So we must look alive." "I say, Dad, I want your help. Do come." Dallas seemed to be speaking in the room. The voice was as nearby and natural as if he had been lounging in his favorite armchair by the fire. The fact would not ordinarily have surprised Archer, for long-distance telephoning had become as much a matter of course as electric lighting and 5-day Atlantic voyages. But the laugh did startle him. It still seemed wonderful that across all those miles and miles of country, forest, river, mountain, prairie, roaring cities, and busy indifferent millions, Dallas laughed, should be able to say, "Of course, whatever happens, I must get back on the 1st, because Fanny Beaufort and I are to be married on the 5th. The voice began again. "Think it over." "No, sir, not a minute." "You've got to say yes now." "Why not?" "I should like to know. If you can allege a single reason." "No." "I knew it." "Then it's a go, eh? Because I count on you to ring up the Cunard office first thing tomorrow. And you should better book a return on a boat from Marseilles." "I say, Dad, it will be our last time together in this kind of way." "Oh, good. I knew you would." Chicago rang off, and Archer rose and began to pace up and down the room. It would be their last time together in this kind of way. The boy was right. They would have lots of other times after Dallas' marriage, his father was sure, for the two were born comrades. And Fanny Beaufort, whatever one might think of her, did not seem likely to interfere with their intimacy. On the contrary, from what he had seen of her, he thought she would be naturally included in it. Still, change was change, and differences were differences, and much as he felt himself drawn toward his future daughter-in-law, it was tempting to seize this last chance of being alone with his boy. There was no reason why he should not seize it, except the profound one that he had lost the habit of travel. May had disliked to move except for valid reasons, such as taking the children to the sea or in the mountains. She could imagine no other motive for leaving the house in 39th Street or their comfortable quarters at the Wellens in Newport. After Dallas had taken his degree, she had thought it her duty to travel for 6 months. And the whole family had made the old-fashioned tour through England, Switzerland, and Italy. Their time being limited, no one knew why they had omitted France. Archer remembered Dallas' wrath at being asked to contemplate Mont Blanc instead of Reims and Chartres. But Mary and Bill wanted mountain climbing, and had already yawned their way in Dallas' wake through the English cathedrals. And May, always fair to her children, had insisted on holding the balance evenly between their athletic and artistic proclivities. She had indeed proposed that her husband should go to Paris for a fortnight, and join them on the Italian lakes after they had done Switzerland. But Archer had declined. "We will stick together," he said, and May's face had brightened at his setting such a good example to Dallas. Since her death, nearly 2 years before, there had been no reason for his continuing in the same routine. His children had urged him to travel. Mary Chivers had felt sure it would do him good to go abroad and see the galleries. The very mysteriousness of such a cure made her the more confident of its efficacy. But Archer had found himself held fast by habit, by memories, by a sudden startled shrinking from new things. Now, as he reviewed his past, he saw into what a deep rut he had sunk. The worst of doing one's duty was that it apparently unfitted one for doing anything else. At least, that was the view that the men of his generation had taken. The trenchant divisions between right and wrong, honest and dishonest, respectable and the reverse, had left so little scope for the unforeseen. There are moments when a man's imagination, so easily subdued to what it lives in, suddenly rises above its daily level and surveys the long windings of destiny. Archer hung there and wondered. What was left of the little world he had grown up in, and whose standards had bent and bound him? He remembered a sneering prophecy of poor Lawrence Lefferts, uttered years ago in that very room: "If things go on at this rate, our children will be marrying Beaufort's bastards." It was just what Archer's eldest son, the pride of his life, was doing, and nobody wondered or reproved. Even the boy's Aunt Janie, who still looked so exactly as she used to in her elderly youth, had taken her mother's emeralds and seed pearls out of their pink cotton wool, and carried them with her own twitching hands to the future bride, and Fanny Beaufort, instead of looking disappointed at not receiving a set from a Paris jeweler, had exclaimed at their old-fashioned beauty, and declared that when she wore them he should feel like an Isabe miniature. Fanny Beaufort, who had appeared in New York at 18, after the death of her parents, had won its heart much as Madame Olenska had won it 30 years earlier. Only instead of being distrustful and afraid of her, society took her joyfully for granted. She was pretty, amusing, and accomplished. What more did anyone want? Nobody was narrow-minded enough to rake up against her the half-forgotten facts of her father's past and her own origin. Only the older people remembered so obscure an incident in the business life of New York as Beaufort's failure, or the fact that after his wife's death he had been quietly married to the notorious Fanny Ring, and had left the country with his new wife and a little girl who inherited her beauty. He was subsequently heard of in Constantinople, then in Russia, and a dozen years later American travelers were handsomely entertained by him in Buenos Aires, where he represented a large insurance agency. He and his wife died there in the odor of prosperity, and one day their orphaned daughter had appeared in New York in charge of May Archer's sister-in-law, Mrs. Jack Welland, whose husband had been appointed the girl's guardian. The fact threw her into almost cousinly relationship with Newland Archer's children, and nobody was surprised when Dallas' engagement was announced. Nothing could more dearly give the measure of the distance that the world had traveled. People nowadays were too busy with reforms and movements, with fads and fetishes and frivolities to bother much about their neighbors. And of what account was anybody's past, in the huge kaleidoscope, where all the social atoms spun around on the same plane? Newland Archer, looking out of his hotel window at the stately gaiety of the Paris streets, felt his heart beating with the confusion and eagerness of youth. It was long since it had thus plunged and reared under his widening waistcoat, leaving him, the next minute, with an empty breast and hot temples. He wondered if it was thus that his son's conducted itself in the presence of Miss Fanny Beaufort, and decided that it was not. It functions as actively, no doubt, but the rhythm is different, he reflected, recalling the cool composure with which the young man had announced his engagement, and taken for granted that his family would approve. The difference is that these young people take it for granted that they are going to get whatever they want, and that we almost always took it for granted that we shouldn't. Only, I wonder, the thing one's so certain of in advance, can it ever make one's heart beat as wildly? It was the day after their arrival in Paris, and the spring sunshine held Archer in his open window, above the wide silvery prospect of the Place Vendôme. One of the things he had stipulated, almost the only one, when he had agreed to come abroad with Dallas, was that, in Paris, he shouldn't be made to go to one of the newfangled palaces. "Oh, all right, of course," Dallas good-naturedly agreed. "I will take you to some jolly old-fashioned place," the Bristol say, leaving his father speechless at hearing that the century-long home of kings and emperors was now spoken of as an old-fashioned inn, where one went for its quaint inconveniences and lingering local color. Archer had pictured often enough, in the first impatient years, the scene of his return to Paris. Then the personal vision had faded, and he had simply tried to see the city as the setting of Madame Olenska's life. Sitting alone at night in his library, after the household had gone to bed, he had evoked the radiant outbreak of spring down the avenues of horse-chestnuts, the flowers and statues in the public gardens, the whiff of lilacs from the flower carts, the majestic roll of the river under the great bridges, and the life of art and study and pleasure that filled each mighty artery to bursting. Now the spectacle was before him in its glory, and as he looked out on it he felt shy, old-fashioned, inadequate, a mere gray speck of a man compared with the ruthless, magnificent fellow he had dreamed of being. Dallas' hand came down cheerily on his shoulder. "Hullo, father, this is something like, isn't it?" They stood for a while looking out in silence. And then the young man continued, "By the way, I've got a message for you. The Countess Olenska expects us both at 5:30. He said it lightly, carelessly, as he might have imparted any casual item of information, such as the hour at which their train was to leave for Florence the next evening. Archer looked at him, and thought he saw in his gay young eyes a gleam of his great-grandmother Mingot's malice. "Oh, didn't I tell you?" Dallas pursued. "Fanny made me swear to do 3 things while I was in Paris: get her the score of the last Debussy songs, go to the Grand Guignol and see Madame Olenska. You know she was awfully good to Fanny when Mr. Beaufort sent her over from Buenos Aires to the Assumption. Fanny hadn't any friends in Paris, and Madame Olenska used to be kind to her and trot her about on holidays. I believe she was a great friend of the first Mrs. Beaufort's. And she's our cousin, of course. So I rang her up this morning, before I went out, and told her you and I were here for 2 days and wanted to see her. Archer continued to stare at him. You told her I was here? Of course, why not? Dallas' eyebrows went up whimsically. Then, getting no answer, he slipped his arm through his father's with a confidential pressure. I say, father, what was she like? Archer felt his color rise under his son's unabashed gaze. Come, own up. You and she were great pals. Weren't you, Wasset? She most awfully lovely. Lovely? I don't know, but she was different. Ah, there you have it. That's what it always comes to, doesn't it, when she comes? She's different and one doesn't know why. It's exactly what I feel about Fanny. His father drew back a step, releasing his arm. About Fanny, but, my dear fellow, I should hope so, only I don't see. Dash it, Dad, don't be prehistoric. Wasn't she once your Fanny? Dallas belonged body and soul to the new generation. He was the firstborn of Newland and May Archer, yet it had never been possible to inculcate in him even the rudiments of reserve. What's the use of making mysteries? It only makes people want to nose him out, he always objected when enjoined to discretion. But Archer, meeting his eyes, saw the filial light under their banter. My Fanny, well, the woman you should have chucked everything for, only you didn't, continued his surprising son. I didn't, echoed Archer with a kind of solemnity. No, you date. You see, dear old boy. But mother said, your mother. Yes, the day before she died. It was when she sent for me alone, you remember. She said she knew we were safe with you, and always would be. Because once, when she asked you to, you should given up the thing you most wanted. Archer received this strange communication in silence. His eyes remained unseeingly fixed on the thronged sunlit square below the window. At length he said in a low voice, She never asked me. No, I forgot. You never did ask each other anything, did you? And you never told each other anything. You just sat and watched each other, and guessed at what was going on underneath. A deaf and dumb asylum, in fact. Well, I back your generation for knowing more about each other's private thoughts than we ever have time to find out about our own. I say, Dad, Dallas broke off, you are not angry with me. If you are, let's make it up and go and lunch at Henry's. I've got to rush out to Versailles afterward. Archer did not accompany his son to Versailles. He preferred to spend the afternoon in solitary roamings through Paris. He had to deal all at once with the packed regrets and stifled memories of an inarticulate lifetime. After a little while he did not regret Dallas' indiscretion. It seemed to take an iron band from his heart to know that, after all, someone had guessed and pitied. And that it should have been his wife moved him indescribably. Dallas, for all his affectionate insight, would not have understood that. To the boy, no doubt, the episode was only a pathetic instance of vain frustration, of wasted forces. But was it really no more? For a long time Archer sat on a bench in the Champs-Élysées and wondered, while the stream of life rolled by. A few streets away, a few hours away, Ellen Olenska waited. She had never gone back to her husband, and when he had died, some years before, she had made no change in her way of living. There was nothing now to keep her and Archer apart, and that afternoon he was to see her. He got up and walked across the Place de la Concorde and the Tuileries Gardens to the Louvre. She had once told him that she often went there, and he had a fancy to spend the intervening time in a place where he could think of her as perhaps having lately been. For an hour or more he wandered from gallery to gallery through the dazzle of afternoon light, and one by one the pictures burst on him in their half-forgotten splendor, filling his soul with the long echoes of beauty. After all, his life had been too starved. Suddenly, before an effulgent Titian, he found himself saying, "But I am only 57," and then he turned away. For such summer dreams it was too late, but surely not for a quiet harvest of friendship, of comradeship. In the blessed hush of her nearness, he went back to the hotel where he and Dallas were to meet, and together they walked again across the Place de la Concorde and over the bridge that leads to the Chamber of Deputies. Dallas, unconscious of what was going on in his father's mind, was talking excitedly and abundantly of Versailles. He had had but one previous glimpse of it, during a holiday trip in which he had tried to pack all the sights he had been deprived of when he had had to go with the family to Switzerland. And tumultuous enthusiasm and cocksure criticism tripped each other up on his lips. As Archer listened, his sense of inadequacy and inexpressiveness increased. The boy was not insensitive, he knew, but he had the facility and self-confidence that came of looking at fate not as a master but as an equal. "That's it. They feel equal to things they know their way about," he mused, thinking of his son as the spokesman of the new generation which had swept away all the old landmarks, and with them the signposts and the danger signal. Suddenly Dallas stopped short, grasping his father's arm. "Oh, by Jove!" he exclaimed. They had come out into the great tree-planted space before the Invalides. The dome of Mansart floated ethereally above the budding trees, and the long grey front of the building, drawing up into itself all the rays of afternoon light. It hung there like the visible symbol of the race's glory. Archer knew that Madame Olenska lived in a square near one of the avenues radiating from the Invalides, and he had pictured the quarter as quiet and almost obscure, forgetting the central splendor that lit it up. Now, by some queer process of association, that golden light became for him the pervading illumination in which she lived. For nearly 30 years, her life of which he knew so strangely little had been spent in this rich atmosphere that he already felt to be too dense and yet too stimulating for his lungs. He thought of the theatres she must have been to, The pictures she must have looked at, the sober and splendid old houses she must have frequented, the people she must have talked with, the incessant stir of ideas, curiosities, images and associations thrown out by an intensely social race in a setting of immemorial manners. And suddenly he remembered the young Frenchman who had once said to him, "Ah, good conversation, there is nothing like it." Is there? Archer had not seen M. Riviere or heard of him for nearly 30 years, and that fact gave the measure of his ignorance of Madame Olenska's existence. More than half a lifetime divided them, and she had spent the long interval among people he did not know, in a society he but faintly guessed at, in conditions he would never wholly understand. During that time he had been living with his youthful memory of her, but she had doubtless had other and more tangible companionship. Perhaps she too had kept her memory of him as something apart, but if she had, it must have been like a relic in a small dim chapel, where there was not time to pray every day. They had crossed the Place des Invalides, and were walking down one of the thoroughfares flanking the building. It was a quiet quarter, after all, in spite of its splendor and its history, and the fact gave one an idea of the riches Paris had to draw on, since such scenes as this were left to the few and the indifferent. The day was fading into a soft sunshot haze, pricked here and there by a yellow electric light, and passers were rare in the little square into which they had turned. Dallas stopped again and looked up. "It must be here," he said, slipping his arm through his father's with a movement from which Archer's shyness did not shrink. And they stood together looking up at the house. It was a modern building, without distinctive character, but many-windowed, and pleasantly balconied up its wide cream-colored front. On one of the upper balconies, which hung well above the rounded tops of the horse-chestnuts in the square, the awnings were still lowered, as though the sun had just left it. "I wonder which floor," Dallas conjectured, and moving toward the porte-cochere, he put his head into the porter's lodge, and came back to say, "The fifth." Archer remained motionless, gazing at the upper windows as if the end of their pilgrimage had been attained. "I say, you know, it's nearly 6, his son at length reminded him. The father glanced away at an empty bench under the trees. "I believe I will sit there a moment," he said. "Why, aren't you well?" his son exclaimed. "Oh, perfectly, but I should like you, please, to go up without me." Dallas paused before him, visibly bewildered. "But, I say, Dad, do you mean you won't come up at all?" "I don't know," said Archer slowly. "If you don't, she won't understand." "Go, my boy. Perhaps I shall follow you." Dallas gave him a long look through the twilight. "But what on earth shall I say? My dear fellow, don't you always know what to say?" his father rejoined with a smile. "Very well. I shall say you are old-fashioned, and prefer walking up the 5 flights, because you don't like lifts." His father smiled again. "Say I am old-fashioned, that's enough." Dallas looked at him again, and then, with an incredulous gesture, passed out of sight under the vaulted doorway. Archer sat down on the bench and continued to gaze at the awninged balcony. He calculated the time it would take his son to be carried up in the lift to the 5th floor, to ring the bell, and be admitted to the hall, and then ushered into the drawing-room. He pictured Dallas entering that room with his quick, assured step, and his delightful smile, and wondered if the people were right who said that his boy took after him. Then he tried to see the persons already in the room, for probably at that sociable hour there would be more than one, and among them a dark lady, pale and dark, who would look up quickly, half rise, and hold out a long thin hand with 3 rings on it. He thought she would be sitting in a sofa corner near the fire, with azaleas banked behind her on a table. "It's more real to me here than if I went up." He sat for a long time on the bench in the thickening dusk, his eyes never turning from the balcony. At length a light shone through the windows, and a moment later a man-servant came out on the balcony, drew up the awnings and closed the shutters. At that, as if it had been the signal he waited for, Newland Archer got up slowly and walked back alone to his hotel,